Hello and welcome. This is India Global. I'm Gauri Dwivedi. Let's start the show with headlines this Tuesday evening. First up, after the unprecedented attack that took place last week at the Brampton Hindu Temple, two temples in Canada have now cancelled consular events. In fact, the management of the temple has said that there is now a very high chance of violent protests to take place on their premises. Russia-India signed major defense deals. Russia and India are set to co-develop Pantsir mobile air defense system that could protect all civilian and military installations from any airborne threats. COP29 summit underway in Baku in Azerbaijan, even as this summit comes at a time when 2024 is set to be the hottest year in human civilization. Will the developed and developing world see through and ensure higher climate finance? Oil prices fell by more than 2% on Monday after China's latest stimulus plan disappointed investors seeking demand growth in the world's second largest oil consuming country. All right, on to our big story that we are tracking on India Global, which is the threat that Indo-Canadians are now feeling. And there is very strong reason for them to now have a very clear idea about the security situation in Canada, which is appalling to say the very least. There's, remember now, a row over the consular camp that was set to be organized in Canada. It is cancelled by Brampton Temple because of and in the wake of that unprecedented attack that took place last week on the temple. And that cancellation also comes at a time when the local police has said that there is a very heightened risk that the temple premises face. And it also says that the tensions should be de-escalated. But how do we go about it? Who does that? Whose responsibility it is that places of worship are protected and consular activities that are set to provide pensioners access to better services, those get resumed? And how long will this situation remain is our big story today on India Global. And to talk about this in greater detail, I have two very important guests to really understand how long will this situation remain, what can India do, what are the options in front of Indo-Canadians who are there at this position and facing those threats. In fact, Terry Miliski joins me on the broadcast from Canada, and Professor Swaran Singh, who's been, in fact, at Vancouver in the past, been at British Columbia in the past, also joins me on the broadcast. In fact, Terry, let me speak to you first. Let me get your perspective first. The fact that these two events have been cancelled indicates just how volatile the security situation is, and many would believe the unwillingness of the authorities to address that.
Well, there is a certain unwillingness. It is, I'm afraid to say, traditional in the case of the Peel Regional Police, which is the police force that issue in this case. Now, I want to explain, first of all, it has to be clear that Justin Trudeau isn't the king of Brampton, Ontario. He doesn't command the local police force. It's not as though the federal government of Canada has been involved in this affair. But there is a long and sad tradition in the Peel Regional Force for, shall we say, treading lightly where Khalistani violence is concerned, and sometimes worse than that. On the other hand, there has been some arrests in these demonstrations, and most recently, a couple of days ago, a gentleman from Sikhs for Justice, which is, as you know, campaigning for a referendum on Sikh independence. He was arrested on a serious charge, assault with a weapon. So it's not as though nothing is being done. However, that's set all of that aside for the moment. The fact remains that this development, having to shut down a planned event for fear of violent riots, it's a black eye for Canada. There's no way around it because it is the role of the police to directly answer your question. It is the
Exactly.
role of the local police to deal with this and make sure that people can carry on their lawful activities in security. It is not the
Absolutely.
role of the local police to say, oh, sorry, you can't do this because there might be riots or things might get violence and we may not be able to do anything about it. So maybe
Exactly.
you should cancel your event or postpone it. That's not good enough, in my view. The police should do much better.
Exactly. Professor Singh, come in there. The fact that these events have been cancelled, the fact that the police have said that they cannot hold these right now, and they've said that there is intel inputs indicating a possible attack, all indicate that there is an unwillingness on the part of the establishment and administration to address it.
Thank you, Gauri, for having me on your program. And I fully agree with Terry's sentiment and assessment. And what is important to underline here is that this cancellation has happened on the assessment of Peel Police. That means in their own assessment, they are not able to provide security to such an event, which means in some sense the state is, shall we say, surrendering to such vociferous movements which are threatening other citizens of Canada or other guests in Canada who Canadian police says we cannot provide security to. And I think that's not a good assessment of what the world thinks of Canada in that sense. And second point, where I will slightly vary from what Terry was mentioning in terms of autonomy of local police, I think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is still the Prime Minister of Canada, and I'm sure his sort of inclinations on various issues, if not directly instruct, definitely encourage a certain behavior on the ground in various parts of
Then, how
Canada,
do we
including.
then, Professor Singh, how do we then ensure that Indians are safe in Canada?
I think we should first respect the sovereignty of Canada and expect that Canadian agencies would ensure that both their citizens, including those of Indian origin, and of course various visitors and people who are on permanent resident in Canada, are provided security, which is the responsibility of the state, Canadian state. And in case this continues to be the situation where the local police is saying we cannot provide protection to the threats that you people face inside Canada, and then I think one has to think beyond what Canada can do in terms of either offering any help that Canada might need in ensuring law and order in their own country, or building certain amount of international collective assessment of how these things should be tackled. And Gauri, if you allow me, there used to be a assessment of Quebec movement, which often talks about secession from Canada. And because it will break Canada into two separate parts, this was sometimes referred as Pakistanization of Canada in that sense. And what you're seeing one after another videos on the ground now really reminds me of that kind of assessment of several scholars who used to talk about Pakistanization of Canada. I hope so many of friends in Canada live, and as you mentioned, I was teaching for a year in University of British Columbia. I hope peace comes back and sanity comes back, and the signal has to come from the apex. I think signal has to come from Justin Trudeau.
Terry, would you like to come in on your thoughts on how can
Yes.
India now keep its citizens and those who are originally from India safe in Canada?
And everyone else too, for that matter. I think Professor Swaran Singh has this absolutely right. Leaders have to lead. And personally, what I would like to see is what I've been howling for these many years is some leadership from federal politicians of all parties who are all guilty in this respect to step up and say what needs to be said here, to say that we cannot tolerate this kind of behavior. We are going to do something about it. You will be arrested if you cross the line, and we're not going to look the other way and let you get away with it. Let me just give you, I'll be very brief, I promise, a small anecdote. A friend of mine back in the day of the Kanishka bombing, this is 1985, friend of mine was beaten up by Khalistanis with baseball bats because he committed the sin of calling for peace in Punjab. He said, let's give peace a chance. He formed a peace group with some Hindu friends. He was a young Sikh, 28 years old, and they beat him nearly to death. What happened exactly? This was in Peel Regional Police's jurisdiction. They came to see him and they said, who bombed Air India? What? How would he know that? They suspected that because he was beaten up, that he was beaten up to punish him for having something to do with the air. They did not understand anything about what was happening. They didn't understand the basics, that this man was beaten because of what he said, because he wanted peace, not because he was involved in the Air India bombing. It made no sense. The Peel Regional Police was out of touch. And in fact, as a second chapter of that, when he applied for compensation as a victim of crime because of his injuries, the Peel Regional Police opposed his application because he wouldn't cooperate and wouldn't tell them who bombed Air India, as though he had any clue. He was a 28-year-old peacenik. He didn't know. So that is an example of what I call the long history, a long and sad history of looking the other way, getting it wrong, not understanding what's going on. Many politicians in Canada still think that this is a case of Sikhs versus Hindus. They haven't grasped yet that it's a case
Khalistan
of
versus
Sikhs
Khalistan
and Hindus
versus
against Khalistanis.
Yes.
That's a different calculation. And they need to understand that, first of all.
Terry, one last question I want to ask you, that just Mr. Trudeau's government may be minority, but he's still the Prime Minister. He's seeing all of this. He's condoning what is happening right now. Forget the one aspect of the bilateral relationship that he has single-handedly killed. The other aspect is that people there, their lives are at risk, and he seems to be doing nothing.
Well, as I said, we have to recall, to be fair, that politicians in Canada are literally not allowed to interfere with local policing, and with good reason. We don't want politicians meddling in local policing and deciding who gets arrested and who doesn't. That way lies what's happening now. We want to avoid that. That's one thing. The second thing is that not everything that goes wrong is Justin Trudeau's fault. I would guess that I'm probably not his favorite journalist, but I will defend him on this, that he doesn't control everything. I would like to see, though, much stronger statements from all the parties, because the Conservatives and the NDP, the left-wing party, which has been propping up Trudeau's government for years now and only recently withdrew from that agreement, they have all looked the other way and done nothing to step up because they're afraid of losing votes. It's just that simple. And there is something they can do, and that is find their voice and use it. They always say, as you well know, that, well, we can't shut down these Khalistani demonstrations because of freedom of speech. Well, okay, the rest of us the politicians have freedom of speech too, don't they?
Exactly.
Why don't they use it?
And let me ask this to Professor Singh. Exactly. Very quickly, sir, I'm running out of time, which is that what is it that some of these politicians can do and must do in the wake of what's happening?
I think they should go for elections and people will speak. And I want to underline for your viewers, Terry on with us here commenting on the situation is not an exception. Canadian media increasingly is now becoming extremely critical. His own ministers, members of parliament, general public is getting disgruntled with this entire exercise. And most of people who are suffering in such a situation are Sikhs themselves. And large number of pensioners are Sikhs there. So I think the best the Canadian politicians can do is ensure that they call for elections as soon as possible, which will make sure that Justin Trudeau is pushed into history and we have a new government in place and we can restart the relationship with Canada again.
All right. Thanks much, Professor Singh and Mr. Terry, for speaking on an issue that most feel very strongly about. Shifting focus now to the other big story that we're tracking right now, which is COP29 summit. It's taking place at a time when, ironically, 2024 is said to be the hottest year in civilization of the longest time that it's been recorded. Can these countries come together, the developed and the developing and the least developed, to find ways to mitigate the effect of climate change, especially on those countries that are impacted the most? Can they identify ways to increase funding to ensure that those who transition in the climate change challenges are covered for? That's the big question, and that's exactly what we are asking today as well on India Global. That as far as India is concerned, what is at stake for India in COP29? Remember, India is positioning itself to be a leader as far as climate challenges are concerned. What is India's position on climate finance and climate accountability is our key question. And let me take that, in fact, to Zerrin Osho Parmezai, who is the Director, India Program, Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, joining me from Baku. Thank you so much for taking out the time. And let me start by asking you, as far as India's stake in this year's COP29 summit in Baku, what, according to you, is New Delhi's stake as far as this summit?
India is going to be looking at, well, very closely. We do not have a pavilion this year. And we are also expecting Minister Bhupinder Yadav to not join this year's COP meeting. What we're going to be expecting is essentially India to follow very closely the negotiations of the NCQG, which is the new finance goal of $1 trillion. This is going to be critical for developing countries to transition away from fossil fuels. And for India in particular, this goal is very important because it finances the gap in our adaptation financing. So last year, 2023, we had the global goal on adaptation, which identified $366 billion as the gap in financing for adaptation. This adaptation finance is critical for India as the heat stress grows. When we have more heat trapping emissions in India, we're starting to look at human survivability testing temperatures of upwards of 50 degrees centigrade. We are looking at a loss of agricultural output. We are looking at impacts on health. So this adaptation finance is going to be key for India. And with the Trump presidency in the US, a lot of it is uncertain. So I think, in my opinion, that is what the government of India is going to be closely following. But of course, unlike other years, we do not have a delegation at present in the pavilion.
All right, Zerrin, what about India's stance as far as climate finance accountability is concerned this year?
India's stance on climate accountability is always been the same. It's basically defined by a principle called common but differentiated responsibility. Accountability is key for India to understand how the budgeting of carbon emissions is going to be done, how the finance is going to be flowing for countries like ours in India, which haven't necessarily caused the problem of climate change historically. These two are key. One is to define what is the amount of aspirations of countries like India, China, Global South that are going to be met using carbon budgets. And then the second one is going to be carbon financing, which is going to relate to how those accountability targets are going to be set. We're also looking at the operationalization of Article 6, which is of the carbon markets. So those two are essentially going to be the focus of India's carbon accountability on finance and the budgeting.
Zerrin, how important is the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement?
Operationalization of Article 6 is key, not only for India, but for the developing countries. Now, with a lack of understanding and certainty with regard to climate finance flowing from the US in light of the recent elections, and with Europe also sort of being uncertain with the fall of the coalition government in Germany, France being completely missing from action here in Azerbaijan, we can look at different instruments of financing taking lead. Article 6 is one of them. So if you want to go into the deeper sets of finance, look at financing projects in the Global South, and also sort of easing out the transition away from fossil fuel, it is important that Article 6 gets operationalized. We need to understand what the operating procedure is going to be, what the financial mechanism is going to look like, what are we going to trade. And one very important point for India, which is the need of the hour for us, is to understand how the framework is going to be set up. To give you an example, we currently use the IPCC methodology, which allows for conversions of all greenhouse gases to CO2 equivalency. It is time we also look into scratching the surface slightly more deeper and understanding why it is important to have the phenomenon of trading like for like. To give you an example, a lot of our methane emissions, which constitute about 14% of India's total emissions profile, are coming from sectors that do not necessarily have a lot of funding and financing or technology innovation. For example, paddy cultivation. It is very important that the government of India, which is already announcing its intention of converting swaths of land from the inundated fields into AWD, which is alternate wetting and drying, and to DSR, deep-seeded rice, start figuring out how it is to create financial incentives. So operationalization of Article 6, including the concept of trading like for like, where we look at GWP 20 for trading methane instead of 100, is going to be key in understanding how to create those financial instruments to get the farmer in India more invested in the transition away from inundated fields, for example, to other technologies and practices to be adopted. Operationalization of Article 6 is going to be key.
All right, Serene. Thanks much for taking out the time and really decoding all this for us. And in fact, on that note, we slip into a very short break. We come back on the other side and talk more about the defense deal that Russia and India have signed. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Global, and the story that we're focusing right now, Russia's first deputy prime minister is in India to bolster bilateral ties and ink important big-ticket deals. And in fact, defense remains a key priority. In a bid to further expand its Make in India defense push, New Delhi has inked a new deal with Moscow, and India's Bharat Dynamics will co-develop the Panzer S-1 short-range air defense system with Russia's counterpart. And my colleague Arjun Samar Mahendran really decodes this in terms of what this defense system is all about and why it's so important from India's perspective.
Now, the Panzer is a mobile air defense system mounted on a truck chassis with a maximum range of up to 12 kilometers. The system is known for its ability to intercept complex, low radar signature targets and high-precision projectiles from multiple launch rocket systems. The system has 12 57E6 or 57E6E surface-to-air missile launchers and 2 dual 30mm automatic cannons. The versatile system is capable of neutralizing fast-moving aerial targets such as drones, helicopters, and cruise missiles at different distances. Moreover, its advanced accessories allow the Panzer to operate independently without external support to detect and engage aerial targets. Each combat vehicle can simultaneously engage up to 4 targets. The system's fire rate is 12 to 16 targets per minute with a lightning-fast reaction time of only 4 to 6 seconds. For now, the system is priced at $15 million. However, the cost is expected to come down once production begins in India. Moreover, many countries, including Algeria, Iran, Iraq, and the UAE, have already deployed the mobile air defense system.
All right, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of India Global. Thanks so much for watching.